It was pointed out to me by a fellow panel member that my talk has the longest title, as you see up there. However, given Ward's presentation, I need to add information graphics to it, so it's going to be longer indeed. But I think that's a wonderful term, and things that I'll be showing here illustrate some of that. Since we're talking about visualization, I thought I would orient you, and you see part of it up here, with a sort of a visual collage outlining some parts of the talk. I'll start with the Big Bang of sorts, which you see on the left. And in this case, it stands for a big data explosion. I'll offer a few simple explanations and some examples of that. The next section, which is shown here by the sort of the pile of 4 graphical things, or information graphics, as Ward was talking about, shows that, you know, the different data is represented in different ways, but there is a but to that. There are similarities, and Katia has already made a sort of an entree into that idea of networks behind things and how you can transform from one form to another. So I'll illustrate that a little bit. I have a short and I hope interesting detour following this to contrast 2 worldviews you see represented up here, an old version from graphics, from art, versus a science map. And we'll see a little bit of the power of a science map such as are shown in Katia's exhibits. I follow this with illustrations and discussions of mental models, and I guess I need to advance here. Here we go. Followed by brief examples of the work I'm involved with that use forms of mental models called image schemata as building blocks for better data models, and meaning, which Ivan referenced by semantics. As time permits, I have a few summary points that may be presented here or part of the later discussion. Okay, so let me move into the area of big data, which is represented visually here as a sort of an explosion taking place in 3 dimensions. You see the ring expanding outward. The 3 dimensions that are listed there are: 1, velocity, data is growing fast and we use it faster; volume, there's more of it; and then there's this thing called variety over here, which means that there are different kinds of data. We have some ideas what that might mean. So different media, our cell phones produce things, the web produces documents, there's the archives of various things were mentioned by the Library of Congress might do. Data grows in part because of mobile devices and streaming media, but also because we have new instruments, such as Hubble telescopes and things looking down at Earth observatories, looking down on our Earth, telling us more about the atmosphere and the water and things of that nature. Back to the volume of the data. I showed it a little bit at the corner here. So Ivan already provided a few statistics. They're always astounding. I have 2 here. One is a 2011 estimate was that we had created at that time, I'm not using exabytes and some of the other terms he has, 5 billion gigabytes. We sort of know gigabytes from our computers are in that realm. This is 5 billion gigabytes per year was estimated, which was about equal to the prior digital composition up to that time was estimated. I read just this week that IBM estimates now we create 2.5 million gigabytes daily. So in 2 days we equal that. Gives you some idea of the explosion. There are a few other aspects of this explosion that I'd like to note before passing on. One is this funnel idea. The raw data shown here is coming in. Of course, raw data is not as much use as analyzed data, right? So we want to do something with it. So this diagram shows sort of the processing it into different data cubes, but in some fashion. Now this problem we have of rapid data, big volumes of data, does remind me of the I Love Lucy episode that many of you might remember, where Ethel and she are on I think it's candy, and are eating the candy because they can't keep up. Well, we can't quite do that with data. But it gets stored off and maybe not used, but that's a loss. And in particular, it's a loss because the data is used in part by models. That's another part of this equation, which is that the data is processed into things, but then it's used to validate or invalidate models, which in turn, the models and their improvement or need for improvement, things like climate change, drive the need to have more data to go out and ask, okay, so now we know this, the model predicts this, can we test that out and validate the model? So that's yet another aspect of this. Okay, so I wanted to, before I move on, I wanted to show some other types of data that may be a little bit more familiar. The one I have here is the sort of a table-oriented version of data, like a spreadsheet. It's actually historical cicada sighting data. It's laid out in a table by type and brood and the period. You know, we were up to the 17-year brood 2 coming into our area, and location. And we can formulate a query, which is just a question, to get back some table of data like that, a spreadsheet, that shows the results. But, you know, they're not as immediately informative as this information graphics that Ward was talking about. So here we have taken that data and plotted some portion of it, in this case, this year, January, the sightings along the Atlantic coast. And of course, there's a code in there, the legend, but we don't have it in this example. Okay, so that's one type of thing we're familiar with. Now, in terms of bigger science using big data, here's an example from something called the Clinical Zone Observatory effort, which is funded by NSF. There are these observatories, a number of places around the U.S., including Puerto Rico, to sort of study the zone in which we live. You can see a little bit of that type of thing we're talking about here. This is the critical zone, the biological zone from the top of the trees touching the air to the bottom of the water levels that are affecting life on Earth. We don't know enough about all of that biogeochemical interaction, and because of things like climate change, we really need to know whether our watersheds are going to be affected as temperatures change and other things change, and there are different water in the air, more floods and rain and things of that nature. So there's an effort funded by NSF to learn something more about that, as noted down here. I mentioned before that data is increasing because there are new instruments, and so this is one of the instruments that actually put things into the ground that are porous, that sort of don't change what's going on particularly, but allow us to measure the biogeochemicals that are involved in that. The data streams on top that you see there are sort of informative. This is one of those information graphics, the charts we're familiar with, and they're showing on the top line, they're showing things on the soil by depth, and they're showing different measurements like temperature and the moistness, the motility or cohesiveness of the soil, or the water volumes. It's sustainable because, you know, at different temperatures the dirt cannot hold as much water or a different amount of water. So that's some of the things that are being studied in the top. And the bottom is studying the chemistry, what's in the waters in there. So with some effort, we can sort of understand what these things are saying. We see seasonal variabilities of these things. We see how different things, different biochemicals, for example, are affected. But it's hard to know what's going on. However, a graphical model can really tell us an awful lot. And so I'm not only talking about big data, I'm talking about data models and scientific models, information graphics of a special type that sort of tell us about relationships, the type of thing, again, that Ward was talking about. We're talking about visualizing water flows and different type of chemical flows and dynamics in this diagram that can communicate a big picture, a visual picture, as it were. Okay, now I'm going to turn to a few of information graphics of different type, and they're different domains organize data differently. I'm starting with one here that might be recognizable as the tree of life. It used to be called the tree of life in Darwin's day. Modern data has evolved that to be more of a network of life. And I contrast that with, or compare that with, a science map over here, such as the type of work that Kathy here has promoted and others do, which looks at, in this case, looking at journal publications, journals, and looks at the interrelationships and shows some dynamics about what fields are related to what fields. So there's an affinity, there is a neighborhood to this. I want to contrast down here with a map, a more traditional map, a weather map, which we recognize that sort of certain weather features are plotted on this, again, state-oriented national map. And we recognize these culturally, as Ward was pointing out, we are acculturated to understand some of these symbols. They're useful to us. So we see fronts and things of that nature. Weather forecast. But what about science forecasts? Well, we might be able to sort of transform some idea of a weather map into idea of a science forecast map. It's a very interesting idea, and Kathy has written some about that. There are actually scientific constructions, concepts, and some work on things called research fronts, which, as noted here, is defined by 40 to 50 actively cited publications. So there is some empirical basis and some theoretical basis by which you might start to create some things that make some sense. And over time, maybe a literate population might start to understand some of these things. Certainly our leaders and funders need to understand some of these things. So this is an example for actual concept from the science of science literature. And to finish up, here is a science map, actually part of the exhibit, so I invite you to see that. This is a hypothetical, I call blended model of the evolution of science. We've been talking about sort of relationship of science on top graphic, and on this weather-related graphic, this is an artist's conception seeing science evolution as sort of a brain evolution, perhaps. And we see a range of things in there, but you can learn much more about that in the exhibit. It's a very interesting metaphor for it. Oh, and let me come back to the first graphic, which was not labeled, but I told you what it was. But it's much more understandable when we do something like this and label that, so we can see what the phyla and the large organisms, the kingdoms are. And in particular, I'll use this. Here we are. It's always nice to know we are. We are here, right? That's a big organizer. Now, speaking of we are here, here's the big picture from an older look at where we are and what things are out there. This is a famous engraving, woodcut rather, and it shows, the woodcut shows sort of the mundane world on the right, and it has a few little features and not particularly important, we recognize that. But a pilgrim has gone to the edge of the earth where the sky curtain meets the earth and has pierced through and is looking at this. I think of it as a Platonic, it was labeled as an Aristotelian view of the universe. The metaphysical, well, Aristotle talks about the metaphysics, the things beyond physics, so it's that sense too, looking at the reality behind there. I'll contrast that with a science map that tells us what's out there and where we are and locates us in a different way. I know you can't see much of that. I have a blow up on the next slide. But the first thing to say is attribution. This is from the third iteration on places and spaces mapping science, 2007, which must have been a great exhibit at the time. I wasn't involved in science maps at that time. It's called The Power of Forecasts. And we noticed several things in here. We noticed there has a you are here, Earth-centric, our solar system. So it gives us in the center, it's geocentric, heliocentric, and it moves out to great distances. And one would imagine time being represented on there. So it has that aspect of it. But it's map-like, and so much more than map-like, because it has a scale to it. It's actually a logarithmic scale for distance. It has a legend. You can't see it here, but there are many things indicated. You can tell by colors and different shapes that there are certain things going on here. It has this wonderful thing on it coming out of the center, bubbling out, which is sort of a timeline. And it turns out that they are looking again at the scientific literature and have areas of candidates of growth. So it's not just the spatial things, it's the science that behind the things that are being identified here. And of course it has the color codes of things I've mentioned. So it has these blue walls that are threads of galaxies that together, and there are, did that come up? Yes, there were quasars. The red lines were quasars. So here is a blow-up of that. It cites the collaboration of people, scientists and graphic artists and other people that were needed to put this type of thing together. And this is a wonderful type of thing you can see digitally. You can zoom in on it from Kathia's site as an example, or buy a wonderful poster. I've given some of these posters to some of my relatives, and a number of them, we have sort of a scientific family, so a number of them were just floored by it, just loved them to death. By the way, I say, Ward, that your 30-foot graphic, I had that around my room as a boy. I remember that graphic. So here we have a blow-up showing a little bit of the solar system at the edge, and now we see that there are dates in terms of discovery of things like, and we see some of the color coding, these gray things are asteroids, and we see there are these yellow things. It turns out to be exoplanets out here, if you can read the legend. And we're moving out farther distance. And we get out to, I see it here. I'm saying that we see a time scale. There is time stamped by the discovery of things, but we also see some thematics of the discovery based on the codes, which type of thing has been discovered. So one of the things that was discovered is this thing called the Great Attractor, which seems to be pulling the Milky Way and Andromeda towards it. It's very far away. We now know a little bit more than was done at this time. It's actually 500 million light years away, and we are moving towards it because it's a fair mass. And then there's this other thing beyond it, which is called the Sloan Great Wall. The Sloan Digital Sky Survey is what sort of did this work, or that provided the data. And this Sloan Great Wall is approximately 1/60th of the diameter of the observable universe, and it's located twice as far away as the Great Attractor. So we're getting, this is the modern science view of where we are. Very powerful, the power of maps. And lastly, it includes, and you might be able to see a few little red things in here. Again, this is that citation idea of the science, the idea of there are certain things that are being discovered that are being actively discussed, and this is noted here in the diagram. So the diagram is rich and beyond what I can actually say here. It's multidimensional. Okay, so now I'm going to move to a fairly complicated slide I hope I can get through. So here, this slide is a cognitive view of mental modeling and visualizing data, starting out with just a person with knowledge and abstraction, looking at nature in some ways. We may be getting rich observational data from a variety of instruments that gives us a picture. The central hypothesis is listed in the middle here. It deals with how our mental models use existing schema within us to organize and interpret input. These are transposable to blended and completely different frameworks as an output space. Resulting blended schemas can be represented in products, informational products that I'll show here. Here's an example of one. We may abstract something from the forest above to something diagrammed as a food web. It adds some knowledge, it adds information from the sensors. Very different visualizations are possible by mental models focusing on different combinations of the same data. So here's an example of a very common interpretation of looking out at the world. It's geospatial interpretation. It's represented by geometries that have land or political features, and these can be overlaid on top of the geometries. Besides these blended outputs, these in turn may be like that land plot there, maybe serve as input to blended with other data to produce more abstract models that ignore the geometry as such as this one. It has a little topological relationship, but it's ignoring a lot of the specific spatial geometry to communicate different ideas. In this case, we have purple migratory paths. The dashed lines are ecological corridors, and the greens are protected areas. It communicates to a human. Now, that's all fine. It's sort of a model communication. It connects to our mental models, understanding of the world, but they're not processable by computers. And the point in the big era of big data is we want to be able to have some help with all that big cube data, like Lucy wanted, with some computational systems, right? So we want to make our computational systems understand some of these things more like a human being so that it can sort of help us in this collaborative analysis effort of the data. It's not good if it's just stored off and never interpreted. So this actually brings us to some of my work, which I'll represent very briefly here. It's sort of a visualization of a network ontology of concepts, networked together. On the top are very general concepts from prior work. On the bottom are sort of new things that are instantiated to help us understand a particular domain. In this case, it's sort of transpiration. But the point about it is that these models may use things like spatial operators for near touches and things of that nature that can actually be processed by computers by representing things logically. And there are languages that are forms that can express this type of thing so that systems can process it. And as noted here, we need to understand a bit more of the cognitive basics, however, to do a good job of building these ontologies, because if they're wrong, then we'll get wrong answers. Now, some of the knowledge is spatial, so let's understand spatial thinking and maps a bit more. And so now I'm going to jump to a discussion of maps, and I start with a quote from Lucy Fellows. It gives part of the idea. Every map is someone's way of getting you to look at the world his or her way. Now this, of course, is perhaps a subjective view, but we might say a map is a simple way of sharing a mental model, and these models are useful as validations by interactions with the world. Let's see how it works in this example here. Here we have two people in a physical reality, and one produces a map for the other. I'll annotate this a little bit. As interpreted here, the map-producing agent has a 2D mental model of the surroundings. And this is up here. He's looking around and representing these things with his mental model. He's going to build a map that has these types of things. The physical map is really a social product produced from this mental map. It has a social purpose as a route map for person 2 who can project where he or she is onto the map, since the abstractions are part of a similar mental map shown in the ideational bubble for that person. If we had different mental models, then we'd have trouble. This last thing is the idea of a model's power. I'm going to skip over this pretty quickly. The idea is that the mental models and maps provide bird's eye view. They have some abstractions so we can see big pictures. They provide frames, they provide focuses, and they provide orientations. But to work, they have to employ concepts that are shareable. But what is that? And how is that? How do we get shareable concepts? Well, it has to be through some type of acculturation. I'm not a Kantian to believe that it's innate entirely. So have a little bit, if I have time, I have a little bit more on that. Okay, I'm going to have to wrap it up soon here. So let me do this slide quickly. This slide is about image schema. They're part of a cognitive linguistic hypothesis developed by Lakoff and Johnson, which proposes that possible human experiences with the world are simple and limited, and a core part of meaning is grounded in perception and action. Piaget said very much the same thing. They've extended an idea of how it gets abstracted and internalized over time. This core meaning is represented in image schemas, which act as a metaphorical frames and cognitive building blocks. We'll probably have some time to discuss later on. So here is just a representation of that from a group called Ideograph. And what they're visually showing here is the idea of the experience of pressure, which becomes a prototype idea for the idea of force. I'm pressed by a force. I internalize some idea of that shown in the bubble, and then I produce signs outside to externalize that. They could be visual signs, they can be words to express that. And then I use those things to communicate to other people. People are going to have slightly varying ideas of that depending on their experiences. And of course, there are many such image schema. I have a list of those. Things like objects in motion and full, empty, and container are obvious examples of things that would be good building blocks from experience we share. I'll note here just in passing that there obviously will be a social evolution based on experience and cultures in formalizing some of these concepts to make things like maps understandable. There's also the idea of conceptual blending, which I don't have time to cover here, but there's a wonderful book called The Way We Think by Falconer and Turner that I highly recommend, and it is readable by a layman, an intelligent layman. And I'll finish up with this particular slide, which sort of gets to my work. So in this slide, what's the payoff? Certainly there's a pleasure in developing theories like this and trying to validate them or not, but that's interesting in itself. But let's test its usefulness. And so if the meaning of a starter concept word like path or motion builds on an image schema knowledge, then formalizing these schemas will make them more processable by computers. And so here is a simple illustration of one schema showing how it works and the structure of it, the components of it. So it has participants like path and moving object. Now, something like path is complicated and has its own schema. Now, we've actually developed these type of things and actually published the research showing it can be used for things like animal movements. Maybe that complicated graph in Napoleon's retreat. We'll see. But here is just to illustrate some of the components of these things, and then the idea that some of these things can be represented by more common things like points with reference points with lat long and things of that nature. But we can also leverage the idea of these other semantics where we have geospatial semantics that have been defined and can be processed by computers for things like over, beneath, next to, and so forth. And this is the reference to where it's being published. And I note in passing in the ending that the important thing about this is the idea of path is general. And we'll be speaking of path of a storm, of innovation, a trip, a migration, even a life or a drug. These may require elaborating the general types of schema, but we think we can do this with actual data from storms and innovations, and we've started on that process. I have one or two slides, but for the sake of time, I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.